Hello and welcome to the guide for Soul Bad Guy. He's currently the new free 5-star collab hero with Guilty Gear. I'll be going over some recommendations in this video and some mechanics, tips, and testing later on. If you want to skip to any of that, you can click the links below. So what are my initial thoughts on Soul Bad Guy? Soul is an extremely strong and versatile PvE hero whom can perform well in PvP if utilized correctly. I like the direction Smalgate is going with this free-to-play friendly hero that can perform at the top tier of PvE and also is still a viable option for PvP. In PVE content, Soul can help players improve their golem clear times or push higher levels of golem. Serve as a primary DPS on almost every fight in Asmacal's raid. Help push higher levels of the Abyss content if you're struggling on certain levels. He's pretty good in almost every single form, as you can probably tell by now, and his animations are pretty short compared to some other 5-star heroes, so that makes him very good for farming. He doesn't rely heavily on other characters on your team in order to be effective, and you can use almost every set of gear on him. There's no really bad option for him. With regards to PvP content, he can be worked into a lot of different team comps. His S2 is very strong, but in the current meta, you may end up hitting a hero with immunity on, or you may end up targeting a water healer like Deanne or Angelica, as they cast multiple heals and buffs on the team. His S3 is very strong in the current meta, and it can also one-shot heroes with immortality like Charon when paired with an Uberus Tooth. His scaling for his gear requirement is quite different in PvE versus PvP because there's certain things that are more effective in PvP versus PvE. He can be put in almost any set, just like PvE content, and he can act as a bruiser, a staller for your team, DPS, or a debuffer. He starts to fall off into the really end game and late game PvP where there's just better options in the Moonlight selection. So, what set should you build Soul? Well, it's pretty much up to you. Almost any set is usable on Soul. Rage will obviously give the most damage as it scales off his moves. PvP and PvE gearing you may want to do a little bit differently because of how some of the moves and mechanics scale. For PvE DPS, since you're relying on more damage percent versus monsters in your moves to get that high damage, crit percent will become much more valuable of a stat versus when you go into PvP and attack's much more valuable of a stat. This is especially apparent if you're using a Daydream Joker for PvE. For PvP DPS, it's more viable to use something like a Uberus Tooth or Junkyard Artifact or many other options out there. For PvE and PvP, your bruiser gearing will be very similar. You're going to want high defensive stats and speed stats with a decent amount of crit damage if you can fit it into your gearing. This may shift depending on what set you use. For example, you may not want as high as speed on a counter set because you're getting a lot of extra turns out of the counters from the S1 and his Fighting Spirit ability. Once you've chosen a set, the next thing you're going to have to decide is what artifact should you wear on Soul. So for PvE DPS, I'm just going to recommend the Daydream Joker. I think it's the best possible option. When I went through a number of tests, it came out #1 by a large margin. So if you have a Daydream Joker, I'd invest it in Soul. For PvP DPS, there are several options here. If you're going for that one hit on Charon or others while you're stripping them, I'd go for a Uberus Tooth or the Junkyard Artifact to get that second turn burn on him to finish him off. A Stark Gauntlet can provide some great effective resistance for Soul and save his life. Sigurd Scythe, El's Fist, Exorcist Tonfuzz, they're all great artifacts in their own right and can be utilized on this hero. So for PvE tanks, I would say if you want the added DPS, you can again go for a Daydream Joker. Start gauntlets can help with fights like Executioner Carcass to make sure that he doesn't land those debuffs, or Sigurd's Scythe to help with that added lifesteal and sustainability. El's Fist is also a viable option because it speeds up your turns, allows you to get the S2 and S3 more frequently, and that extra DPS, especially if you're using him as a frontliner, is going to start to shine. So now if you're going to use him for more of a PvP tank, I would recommend probably Start Gauntlets, as it'll help immensely against the current meta. Resisting a skill could be the difference between life and death. Sigurd's Scythe is another viable option to help you sustain on some of those longer fights. And El's Fist, especially if you can tank for a while. So let's get to the big question. Should I pull and invest Molagora into Soul? Well, if you want an extremely strong PVE character that can help you out with a lot of PVE content and also be decent at Guild Wars and Arena, I would consider investing in him. One of the main reasons being that you can also SSS imprint him off of the extra copies you get from week 2 and 4 apparently from the arena. For Molagora advice, I would say that his S3 is probably his strongest investment, especially up to get that 1-turn cooldown reduction. And if you're going for more PvE centric, I would invest more into your S2 after that. And for more PvP centric, I would consider investing more into the S1 before the S2. So now let's move on to his mechanics and some tips for Soul. So Soul uses Fighting Spirit much like Ken does, except for there's a difference in how he burns his Fighting Spirit. So he generates his Fighting Spirit on his S1 on a critical strike for 20% or 20 points, and on his S3 he generates 60% or 60 points of Fighting Spirit. Once he reaches 100 Fighting Spirit, whether it be off of a dual attack, a counter attack, Soul gets an extra turn and extends his buffs for 1 turn. So he'll immediately go after he has this turn and be able to use the buffs for the next round also. So this is much better than a lot of other mechanics in the game where the user gets another turn like RNL, but then their buffs are stripped off of them. So now over to some quick tips. So for PvE, there's a few quick tips I'd just like to highlight. One of the quick tips is that Daydream Joker and crit damage scale insanely well with Soul. Attack percent isn't always going to give you the return you want on damage per round. You're better off going with the crit damage. Raid set can add a lot of DPS and can turn him into a real monster when it comes to hitting bosses. Don't be afraid to use him as a tank or other roles if you need to fill him in that slot, as he's versatile and allows a lot of build diversity. Now for some PvP tips. His S2 can easily get eaten up by an invulnerability or may miss on Angelica and DN. His S3 can auto-kill Kayron, who's immortal, or other targets if paired with Uber's Tooth, or on the next turn if you pair it with his artifact. With a base speed of 119, you can easily make him go first and strip one character. And don't be afraid to use Start Gauntlet because it is really, really good in the current meta for PvP. Now, let's talk about some of his scaling numbers. So for his S1, he's got a 1.0 scaling, but gets that extra 20% damage on the target if they're unbuffed. His S2 is another 1.0 scaling, but you also get a 4% max target health on the strike. His S3 is 1.6 scaling and has an added 6% max damage of the target's health. Now we're going to take a look at some of the tests I did. These tests and the calculations are all very rough, but give you a general idea of what's going on. There were some tests that weren't included on this sheet, and based on our comparisons between damages with the different sets given, I found that on any large target boss, crit damage is going to far outclass attack by a significant amount. There's no comparison. Because of the large amount of damage coming from enemy monster health, scaling is really good for new players, so it's going to be easy to clear content. There's very little reliance on the build, so you also have a lot of build diversity. When comparing it to Daydream Joker for his PVE DPS, it was night and day difference. No matter what other artifact you're using in the current artifact list, you're always going to get the most damage out of Daydream Joker. And I also found that Rage Set does give that larger amount of DPS boost as expected, but it's actually not as high as we were expecting, and I'm not sure whether that was an error in my testing or if there were some skills that weren't being multiplied correctly from the Rage Set, if it doesn't overlap every single skill and molagora damage. So that's about it for this video. Thanks everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed this guide, and if you have any questions or feedback, please leave them in the comments below. I'm gonna just end this video by playing some footage of the tests I did, and I hope everyone has a great day.